Royal Guard BREAKS gate lock after finding Charlotte's note. She won't let me leave. He had seen children grow up under the watchful eyes of their families and the staff, had observed their laughter, their curiosity, and sometimes their mischief. His training had taught him to remain calm and vigilant at all times, no matter what unfolded around him. Even so, nothing could completely prepare him for the delicate balance of protecting the young princes while navigating the complex dynamics of the royal family and their guests. It was a bright spring afternoon, with the sun shining warmly over the palace gardens. The air carried the sweet scent of blooming roses and jasmine, and the distant sound of a fountain trickling added a serene melody to the scene. The garden was bustling with activity. Children ran through the manicured lawns, their laughter ringing through the air, while attendants moved quietly along the gravel paths, attending to the needs of the guests. Some of the visitors had come for a formal tea, while others were family friends, enjoying a rare, informal gathering in the open air. Edward had been stationed near the garden's main walkway, his eyes sweeping carefully over the area. Even though it was meant to be a relaxed event, his attention never wavered. He noticed subtle details, the way a child held a toy too tightly, the way a guest lingered a little too close to the younger members of the royal family. Every movement mattered because the safety of the children was his responsibility. Prince George, a lively and curious young boy, had been exploring the garden with the natural curiosity only a child could possess. He darted from flowerbed to flowerbed, fascinated by the bees and butterflies flitting from bloom to bloom. His small hands reached out to touch the petals, to feel their delicate softness, and his eyes sparkled with excitement. Edward had observed George many times before and knew how energetic he could be. Yet, there was a certain innocence in George's movements, a mixture of wonder and carelessness that made him all the more endearing and, simultaneously, someone who needed constant supervision. Nearby, Arthur, Camilla's teenage son, had joined the gathering. Arthur was a bright boy, full of energy and confidence, and he had grown up in the shadow of royal attention. He loved being part of the events, though he sometimes struggled to understand the boundaries expected in such a formal environment. On this particular afternoon, he had been encouraged by his mother to interact with the young prince, a gesture meant to be friendly. Yet Arthur, like many teenagers, had a playful side and a desire to assert himself, which could sometimes be misinterpreted as overconfidence. Edward noticed Arthur approaching George from a distance. At first, the scene appeared innocent enough, two children moving closer to one another, perhaps preparing to engage in playful conversation. But Edward's trained eyes picked up the subtle tension in Arthur's posture, the way his hand was raised slightly, and the way his gaze seemed fixed on George's arm. A small warning bell went off in Edward's mind. It was not a loud alarm, but a quiet instinct, a whisper that told him something might go wrong if he did not intervene. Suddenly, George let out a small yelp, and Edward saw Arthur's hand grip George's arm a little too firmly. It was not an aggressive act in the traditional sense, but it was enough to make the young prince uncomfortable. George's body stiffened, and he looked up at Edward with a mixture of surprise and unease. In that moment, Edward's instincts took over. He stepped forward with calm authority, placing a reassuring hand on George's shoulder to steady him. "Easy now," Edward said softly but firmly. His voice was gentle, yet it carried the unmistakable weight of authority, a reminder that he was present and watching. Arthur, caught off guard, quickly let go, his eyes widening as he realized that his playful action had been noticed. He looked at Edward with a mixture of embarrassment and confusion, unsure of how to respond. Edward, ever mindful of the delicate situation, did not scold or humiliate him. Instead, he maintained a composed demeanor, making it clear that his concern was George's comfort and safety, not punishment. The garden, which had been filled with cheerful noise, now carried a subtle hush as the nearby attendants and guests observed the interaction. While Edward's focus remained entirely on the children, he was acutely aware of the social dynamics at play. Handling such situations required more than vigilance. It required diplomacy, patience, and an understanding of the emotions involved. He knew that even a minor incident could be blown out of proportion if handled poorly, potentially causing embarrassment or tension among the family and their guests. Edward guided George a few steps away from the main walkway, ensuring he was out of immediate reach while keeping Arthur nearby. "It's important to be gentle," Edward explained, kneeling slightly to meet Arthur's eye level. "Even if you're just playing, we have to remember that George is younger, and he might get hurt without meaning to. We need to make sure everyone enjoys themselves safely." Arthur nodded, his initial embarrassment slowly giving way to understanding. Edward's calm and patient approach helped diffuse the tension. He realized that the boy did not intend to cause harm, and his response needed to reinforce good behavior without causing shame. It was a delicate balance, and Edward executed it with quiet skill. Meanwhile, George relaxed slightly under Edward's protective presence. The prince's natural curiosity had not been dampened, but he now understood that someone was watching over him. Edward's reassuring hand remained on his shoulder, offering a sense of security without being overbearing. It was a small but important gesture, reminding George that he was safe to explore and enjoy the garden. The atmosphere in the garden gradually returned to its light-hearted rhythm. Edward kept a watchful eye on both boys, moving subtly to position himself where he could intervene if necessary, but otherwise allowing them the freedom to interact. He understood that children, even in royal households, needed space to learn and play. Yet, he remained ever ready to step in at the first sign of trouble. Edward's mind briefly wandered as he observed Arthur and George. He reflected on the challenges of working within the royal household, where every action could carry unintended consequences. The balance between protection, guidance, and freedom was delicate, especially when young children were involved. He had learned over the years that a gentle word, a careful gesture, or a timely intervention could prevent small misunderstandings from escalating into significant incidents. As the afternoon sun cast a warm glow over the garden, Edward allowed himself a small sigh of relief. So far, the situation had been managed quietly, without any embarrassment or upset. He knew that vigilance was an ongoing task, and that the unpredictable nature of children meant he could never relax completely. But in this moment, he felt a sense of quiet satisfaction in having prevented a potential mishap before it could occur. Edward straightened, scanning the garden once more. Both boys were now interacting more calmly, their earlier tension replaced with cautious curiosity. Edward's presence, though discreet, had reminded them both of boundaries and respect. The palace staff moved about, returning to their duties, and the formal gathering continued, with the gentle laughter of children blending harmoniously with the ambient sounds of the garden. Though the incident had been minor, Edward knew it was a valuable reminder of his role. He was not only a guardian of the royal children's safety, but also a guide, a mentor, and a calming presence in moments of uncertainty. His training, experience, and intuition had all converged to manage the situation smoothly, preserving the dignity of everyone involved while ensuring the young prince remained safe and comfortable. As Edward returned to his subtle patrol along the garden's perimeter, he allowed himself a quiet moment of reflection. Protecting young royals was not simply a matter of rules and protocol. It was about understanding human nature, reading emotions, and intervening with both strength and compassion. Today, he had done just that, and in doing so, he had helped maintain the harmony of the palace, allowing the afternoon to continue without incident. And so, beneath the warm sunlight and the gentle rustle of leaves, Royal Guard Edward remained vigilant, ready for whatever challenges the day might bring, quietly proud that his careful attention had ensured the safety and happiness of the children he was sworn to protect. The garden had settled back into its cheerful rhythm after the small incident between Prince George and Arthur. Yet Edward, the royal guard, remained alert. He knew that even in moments of calm, young children could act unpredictably, and the palace's busy environment made it necessary to stay vigilant. Edward's eyes scanned the surroundings carefully, noting every movement of the guests, attendants, and the young princes. Though the sun cast a warm, golden glow over the lawns, and the sound of laughter floated through the air, his mind stayed focused on the task at hand, ensuring that every child in his care remained safe. Arthur, Camilla's son, had retreated a few steps after Edward's intervention. He looked embarrassed but also curious. Teenagers, Edward thought, often acted without thinking, not out of malice, but because they wanted to explore boundaries. Edward knew that Arthur had been encouraged to interact with Prince George by his mother, Camilla, in hopes of fostering friendship. But social etiquette, especially in a royal setting, could be tricky for young boys who had grown up with attention, but without strict supervision in informal moments. Edward understood that Arthur needed guidance rather than scolding. Edward moved closer, his presence calm but unmistakable. He had seen similar situations before, where children's playful curiosity could unintentionally turn into discomfort or hurt. Kneeling slightly, he spoke to Arthur in a soft voice. "It's okay to play, but remember, George is younger. We have to be gentle even if it's just a game." He carefully chose his words, making sure Arthur understood that it wasn't a reprimand, but a lesson in care and respect. Arthur listened, shifting his weight from one foot to the other. His cheeks were flushed, a mix of embarrassment and the realization that his strength had surprised the younger boy. Edward continued, keeping his tone steady and friendly. "It's important to notice how the other person feels. That way everyone can have fun safely." He smiled lightly, trying to ease the tension, and Arthur's frown softened a little. Nearby, Prince George had regained his composure. The young boy's bright eyes were filled with curiosity again, and he had already turned back to the flowers, examining a cluster of bluebells that swayed gently in the breeze. Edward's hand remained near George, a subtle reassurance that he was there if needed. The prince's laughter returned, light and musical, blending with the soft rustling of leaves in the wind. Edward felt a quiet satisfaction. This small, calm moment was exactly what he hoped to achieve. Children free to explore, but within safe boundaries. Edward then took a careful glance around the garden. The palace had always emphasized the importance of balance. Formality when needed, playfulness in appropriate moments, and safety at all times. Today's gathering was designed to be informal, allowing guests and young royals to enjoy the outdoors and each other's company. Yet Edward understood that informality required careful attention. The palace gardens were beautiful but vast, with hidden corners and narrow paths where children could wander quickly. Maintaining awareness of every movement required constant vigilance. As he walked slowly along the garden path, Edward noticed a few other children running together near the fountain. Their laughter rang through the air, and one of them stumbled slightly, catching themselves just before falling. Edward's presence was calm but watchful, his movements measured. He knew that even a small fall could turn into a serious issue if not attended to. Quietly, he approached the group, his posture relaxed but alert, and ensured that the children were safe before moving on. Meanwhile, Arthur, encouraged by Edward's gentle guidance, attempted to approach George again. This time, his movements were slower, more cautious. He offered a shy smile and held out his hand in a playful gesture rather than gripping George's arm. Edward observed the interaction carefully, noting how Arthur was beginning to understand the boundaries he needed to respect. With a slight nod, Edward signaled his approval, reinforcing positive behavior without interrupting their interaction. Camilla, Arthur's mother, had been watching from a distance. Her eyes showed a mixture of concern and curiosity. She understood that Edward's role was not just to protect Prince George, but also to guide young visitors like her son. She appreciated the guard's patience and professionalism, recognizing that handling children in the royal environment required a delicate balance of authority, empathy, and calm presence. Edward caught her glance and offered a polite nod, a silent acknowledgement that he was managing the situation responsibly. Edward's thoughts briefly drifted as he considered the challenges of his position. Being a royal guard was about more than enforcing rules. It was about understanding human behavior, anticipating needs, and responding before small issues became problems. He reflected on the many afternoons he had spent in the palace gardens, watching children explore, learning how to interact with peers, and observing the subtle dynamics between families and staff. Each moment taught him something new about patience, empathy, and the quiet art of intervention. As the afternoon progressed, the sun climbed higher in the sky, casting long, warm shadows across the lawns. Edward continued his careful patrol, weaving through groups of children, checking the paths, and observing interactions. His training emphasized subtlety, remaining present without being intrusive. He understood that the young princes, especially George, needed both freedom and protection. Too much interference could stifle curiosity, while too little attention could allow accidents or misunderstandings to occur. Edward's calm vigilance had another effect. It set an example for the children. George and Arthur, while still cautious, began to interact more confidently and respectfully. Edward's quiet presence reminded them that rules existed for safety, not punishment, and that guidance could be kind rather than strict. Watching the boys engage in this way gave Edward a sense of accomplishment. Moments like these, though small, were the ones that built trust between the royal household and the children in their care. A soft breeze passed through the garden, carrying the scent of roses and freshly cut grass. The sunlight reflected off the fountain's water, creating a sparkling effect that delighted the children. Edward allowed himself a brief glance at the scenery, appreciating the beauty of the moment. Even in a life filled with routine duties, these simple, quiet experiences reminded him why his work mattered. He was not only protecting the young royals, but also helping them enjoy the magic of childhood safely. Edward noticed that Arthur had begun asking George questions about the flowers and the small birds perched nearby. The younger prince responded with curiosity, pointing out colors and shapes, and Edward's heart lifted at the sight. The boys were learning to communicate, explore, and share experiences under his careful watch. The earlier tension had transformed into a gentle, natural interaction, and Edward felt a quiet pride in facilitating that change. As the afternoon continued, Edward remained a constant presence in the garden. He moved subtly among the children, observing, guiding, and protecting without drawing attention to himself. His patience and experience allowed him to manage the delicate social dynamics that surrounded the royal children, including interactions with visiting family members like Arthur. Edward knew that his calm and measured approach would be remembered long after the gathering ended, leaving a lasting impression of safety, trust, and understanding. By the time the afternoon sun began to dip toward the horizon, casting a soft, golden glow across the palace grounds, Edward felt a sense of quiet satisfaction. The children had played safely, learned important lessons about respect and gentleness, and enjoyed the beauty of the garden. Prince George's laughter had returned fully, and Arthur seemed more aware of how to interact appropriately. The palace staff moved about efficiently, ensuring that everything was in order for the evening. Edward's role, though often unnoticed by the guests and even by the children themselves, had been crucial. His vigilance, patience, and careful guidance had prevented a minor misunderstanding from escalating, and he had managed to preserve both safety and harmony in the garden. As he walked back toward the palace entrance, he reflected on the simple but important truth of his work. Even small actions, taken with care and attention, could make a meaningful difference in the lives of others. Edward knew that more challenges would come. Children would continue to play, explore, and test boundaries, and the palace environment would remain a complex space filled with rules, expectations, and traditions. Yet he felt prepared. He had the experience, the training, and the calm presence necessary to handle whatever arose, ensuring that the young royals and their guests could enjoy their day safely. As he took his position near the palace gates, Edward allowed himself a quiet moment to breathe. The garden was now calm, the laughter of children mingling with the distant chime of the palace clock. He watched as George and Arthur interacted once more, now with understanding, respect, and newfound confidence. Edward's heart lifted, knowing that his careful intervention had helped transform a potentially tense moment into one of learning and friendship. And so Edward stood watch, attentive, calm, and ready, quietly proud of the way he had guided the young princes and their guests, ensuring that the palace garden remained a place of joy, safety, and gentle discovery for all who wandered its paths. The afternoon sunlight had begun to soften, casting long, warm shadows over the palace gardens. Edward, the royal guard, had maintained a careful watch over Prince George and Arthur throughout the day, ensuring that their interactions remained safe and friendly. The garden had regained its cheerful atmosphere, with children running between flower beds and attendants moving quietly along the gravel paths. Yet Edward knew that even as things appeared calm, the unpredictable nature of children and the delicate dynamics of royal visits required constant attention. Arthur had grown more cautious since the earlier incident, but there was still an energy in him that could quickly turn into mischief if not guided. Edward observed the boy from a short distance, ensuring that his movements remained respectful while allowing him space to enjoy himself. He understood that teenagers often wanted to test boundaries, not out of defiance but from curiosity and a desire to learn how to behave in complex social settings. Edward's role was to provide that guidance without making the boy feel restrained or embarrassed. Prince George, on the other hand, had regained his cheerful composure. His bright eyes sparkled with curiosity as he wandered among the garden's flower beds, examining the delicate petals and marveling at the colors and shapes of the blossoms. Edward kept a protective distance, ready to intervene if necessary, but allowing George the freedom to explore. The young prince's laughter floated through the air, blending harmoniously with the soft rustle of leaves and the distant murmur of the palace fountain. Suddenly, Edward noticed Arthur move closer to George again. This time, the boy approached with a slower, more careful step. His eyes were focused on the younger prince, but his hand, which had caused tension earlier, was now relaxed. Edward's heart lifted slightly. The earlier lessons seemed to have taken hold. Arthur was learning to respect George's space, understanding that gentleness was necessary even in playful interactions. Edward decided to remain nearby but unobtrusive, allowing the boys to interact under his watchful eye. He knew that stepping in too soon could make Arthur feel judged, while waiting too long could risk another misunderstanding. It was a delicate balance, one that required patience, observation, and a quiet sense of authority. Edward had spent years mastering this balance, and today was no different. Arthur offered a small smile to George, and this time his approach was entirely friendly. "Look at this flower," he said softly, pointing to a bright red tulip near the fountain. George turned his attention to the bloom, his eyes lighting up with wonder. "It's so bright!" he exclaimed, reaching out carefully to touch the petals. Edward felt a sense of relief. The boys were communicating, sharing experiences, and learning to interact with consideration and curiosity. Camilla, Arthur's mother, observed from a distance. She had watched Edward handle the earlier incident with professionalism and patience, and now she saw the results. Her son was learning to behave appropriately without feeling humiliated or restricted. She felt a quiet gratitude for the guard who had managed the delicate situation with such skill. Edward caught her gaze and offered a polite nod, acknowledging her silent appreciation while maintaining his focus on the children. As the boys continued their exploration, Edward reflected on the importance of his role. Being a royal guard was not just about enforcing rules or protecting children from harm. It was about understanding emotions, anticipating behavior, and responding in ways that guided rather than punished. He thought about the many afternoons he had spent in the palace gardens, observing children's curiosity and guiding their interactions. Each moment taught him something new about patience, empathy, and the subtle art of intervention. The palace garden itself seemed to respond to the calm atmosphere. Birds sang from the branches of tall trees, butterflies flitted between flowers, and the gentle breeze carried the sweet scent of roses and jasmine. Edward allowed himself a brief moment to appreciate the beauty around him, but his attention remained sharp. Even in serene moments, a child could wander too far, a guest could misstep, or a small misunderstanding could arise. His focus was a quiet but constant presence, ensuring safety while preserving the natural flow of the afternoon. Edward noticed that George had wandered near the edge of the fountain, his small hands trailing over the cool water as he observed the ripples. Arthur followed carefully, pointing out the reflections of the sky and trees on the water's surface. Edward moved closer, positioning himself between the boys and any potential hazards, yet remaining unobtrusive. His presence was a silent reassurance, a protective shadow that allowed the children to explore freely without fear. The boys began to talk more openly, sharing their observations and thoughts. Arthur asked George questions about the different flowers and insects they saw, and George responded with excitement, pointing out colors, shapes, and movements. Edward smiled quietly to himself. The earlier tension had transformed into a gentle, natural interaction, one that demonstrated growth, understanding, and respect. Edward's mind briefly wandered to the importance of these moments. In a palace setting, even seemingly minor interactions carried weight. The behavior of children, how they learned to interact, and the guidance they received could influence their development and relationships for years to come. Edward took pride in knowing that his careful attention and gentle interventions played a role in shaping positive experiences for the young royals and their guests. As the afternoon wore on, Edward continued his quiet patrol, moving gracefully along the garden paths. He observed other children, making sure they remained safe while still allowing them to enjoy the freedom of play. His experience allowed him to predict potential risks before they occurred, and his calm presence reassured the children without making them feel restricted. Edward understood that the best guidance was often subtle, visible only in the gentle corrections and careful supervision he provided. Arthur, encouraged by Edward's approach, began to show more confidence. He suggested exploring a new section of the garden together, pointing toward a shaded path lined with tall hedges. George hesitated for a moment but then nodded, trusting both his own curiosity and Edward's quiet watchfulness. Edward followed at a careful distance, prepared to intervene if necessary, but allowing the boys to experience a sense of adventure. The shaded path led them to a small grove of trees, where sunlight filtered through the leaves, creating patterns on the ground. George's eyes widened in wonder, and Arthur's excitement grew as he explored alongside his younger companion. Edward observed their interactions carefully, noting the gestures, the conversation, and the shared sense of curiosity. It was a delicate dance, allowing freedom while maintaining safety, and Edward executed it with quiet precision. Edward also noticed the reactions of the palace staff. They moved about efficiently, aware of the need to maintain order while allowing the children their play. Attendants exchanged subtle nods, recognizing Edward's skill in managing the situation without drawing unnecessary attention. The atmosphere remained calm, cheerful, and orderly, a testament to Edward's vigilance and professionalism. As the afternoon progressed, Edward reflected on the lessons being learned in this small moment. Arthur was learning respect, patience, and consideration, while George was learning to navigate social interactions and enjoy safe exploration. Edward's role was not just about protection. It was about fostering growth, confidence, and understanding in young minds. Each step he took, each subtle intervention, contributed to a positive experience that would remain with them long after the day ended. Eventually, the boys paused near a small fountain in the grove, taking a moment to rest and observe the water. George reached out, feeling the cool surface, and Arthur watched him carefully, making sure not to crowd or startle him. Edward approached, kneeling slightly to speak with them at eye level. "You're both doing very well," he said softly. "It's wonderful to explore and have fun as long as we are kind and careful with each other." The boys nodded, smiling, understanding the message without feeling scolded or restricted. Edward felt a quiet sense of accomplishment. The earlier incident, which had the potential to cause discomfort or conflict, had transformed into a lesson in patience, respect, and friendship. The children had learned and grown under his guidance, and Edward's careful attention had ensured that the garden remained a safe and joyful place for exploration. As the sunlight began to fade toward evening, casting a golden hue over the palace grounds, Edward allowed himself a brief moment of satisfaction. The boys had interacted successfully, learning from one another and from his quiet guidance. The garden remained orderly, cheerful, and safe. Edward knew that challenges would continue, that children would still test boundaries, and that vigilance was a constant necessity. Yet in this moment, he felt content, knowing that his careful intervention had made a real difference. Edward returned to his patrol along the perimeter of the garden, his eyes scanning for any potential concerns. He understood that his work was ongoing, a constant balance between freedom and safety, play and guidance. Yet he took pride in the subtle ways he influenced the young princes and their guests, ensuring that they could enjoy the beauty of the palace gardens while learning important lessons in behavior, respect, and friendship. And so Edward continued to watch, patient, calm, and attentive, quietly proud that his presence had turned a potential moment of tension into a valuable learning experience, ensuring that Prince George and Arthur could continue to enjoy their afternoons safely and happily. The palace gardens had grown quieter as the afternoon sun began its descent toward the horizon, casting a warm, golden glow over the neatly trimmed lawns and flower beds. The soft rustle of leaves and the gentle trickle of the fountain created a peaceful melody, contrasting with the lively activity from earlier. Edward, the royal guard, had been keeping a careful watch over Prince George and Arthur all day, and he now noticed a shift in the atmosphere. The boys' earlier energy had calmed into a focused curiosity, and Edward sensed that it was the perfect moment to guide them toward reflection and understanding. Prince George was examining a small cluster of daisies near the fountain, his tiny hands brushing the petals gently as he marveled at their delicate beauty. His eyes were wide with wonder, and Edward observed him with a quiet smile. The young prince's natural curiosity was one of the traits that made him so endearing, but Edward had learned over the years that curiosity without guidance could sometimes lead to misunderstandings or minor accidents. His role was not just to protect George from harm, but also to help him navigate social interactions in a safe and meaningful way. Arthur, on the other hand, had grown noticeably more cautious throughout the afternoon. The earlier incident, when he had grabbed George's arm too firmly, had clearly left an impression. Edward could see the change in the teenager's demeanor, a mixture of attentiveness and respect, tempered with his usual curiosity and playful spirit. Edward knew that young teenagers often struggled to find the balance between enthusiasm and care, and he appreciated that Arthur was beginning to understand this delicate line. Edward decided that it was time to have a gentle conversation with the boys, one that would reinforce the lessons of the day while allowing them to feel confident and respected. He moved closer to George first, crouching slightly to meet the young prince at eye level. "George," Edward said softly, "you've been very curious today, and that's wonderful. Exploring and asking questions helps us learn, but it's also important to remember our friends and to be gentle with them." George nodded thoughtfully, absorbing Edward's words. The young boy's eyes held a glimmer of understanding, and he reached out cautiously toward Arthur, offering a small smile. Edward then turned his attention to Arthur, who had been watching silently, his expression a mixture of concentration and anticipation. Kneeling slightly, Edward spoke in a calm, even tone. "Arthur, you've been very kind in helping George explore today, and that's good. But remember, everyone has their own space, and we need to respect that. Being careful doesn't mean you're less fun. It means you're thoughtful and trustworthy." Arthur's face brightened as he processed Edward's words. He realized that his earlier actions had been too forceful, not because he intended harm, but because he had been too eager to engage. Edward's explanation had given him a clear understanding without making him feel embarrassed or reprimanded. The boy nodded, a quiet determination forming in his eyes, showing that he wanted to do better. The two boys looked at each other, and for a moment there was a sense of mutual understanding. George's small hand gently touched Arthur's arm, a gesture of acceptance and trust. Edward smiled to himself, recognizing the significance of the moment. What had begun as a tense interaction was now evolving into a quiet, meaningful exchange, one that demonstrated respect, understanding, and the potential for friendship. Edward reflected on the importance of these subtle moments in the palace. It was not always grand gestures or formal events that shaped the young royals and their peers. Sometimes, the quiet guidance, gentle conversations, and thoughtful supervision had the most lasting impact. Today, he had managed to turn a potentially uncomfortable incident into a learning experience, one that would stay with both boys as they continued to grow. The palace staff, who had been discreetly observing from a distance, exchanged subtle nods of approval. They recognized Edward's skill in handling the situation with patience, tact, and empathy. His calm presence had allowed the children to explore their curiosity while maintaining safety, a balance that required experience, attentiveness, and a deep understanding of human behavior. As the boys continued to explore, Edward guided them gently along a shaded pathway lined with flowering hedges. The sun's rays filtered through the leaves, creating intricate patterns of light and shadow on the ground. George paused to examine a small butterfly resting on a flower, his tiny fingers hovering carefully nearby. Arthur leaned closer, pointing out the butterfly's vibrant colors and delicate wings. Edward observed silently, appreciating the quiet cooperation and shared curiosity between the two boys. Edward knew that these shared experiences were important for building character. They taught patience, observation, and the value of respecting others. He had witnessed countless interactions between young royals and visiting children, and he understood that these seemingly small moments often carried lessons far more significant than the children realized at the time. Today, Edward had successfully guided both boys through such a moment, turning their curiosity into an opportunity for growth and learning. As they approached a small gazebo at the edge of the garden, Edward suggested a brief rest. The boys sat on the wooden benches, their faces lit with excitement and contentment. Edward spoke gently, his voice calm and reassuring. "It's wonderful to explore and ask questions," he said, "but it's also important to pause and think about how our actions affect others. Today, you've both done very well in learning to be careful, patient, and kind." George looked up at Edward with a bright smile. "I like learning with Arthur," he said softly. Arthur nodded, a shy smile appearing on his face. Edward felt a quiet satisfaction. The earlier tension had transformed into cooperation, understanding, and a sense of camaraderie. The boys had learned to interact thoughtfully, guided by his patient supervision. Camilla, observing from a short distance, approached quietly. She looked at her son with a mix of pride and relief. "Edward," she said softly, "thank you for guiding Arthur so patiently. I can see he's learning important lessons today." Edward nodded respectfully. "It's my pleasure, ma'am," he replied. "The boys have been doing very well, and it's wonderful to see them learning together." As the sun continued to set, casting a soft orange glow across the gardens, Edward reflected on the day's events. He had managed to turn a potentially tense moment into a positive, instructive experience for both boys. The careful guidance, patient explanations, and subtle interventions had allowed George and Arthur to explore safely, learn important social lessons, and develop a sense of mutual respect. Edward understood that his role was not only about protection, but also about mentorship, empathy, and teaching through example. Edward's thoughts were interrupted by a gentle breeze that rustled the leaves above them. The tranquil scene reminded him of why his work mattered so much. Beyond the protocols, security, and duties, his presence created an environment where young royals could grow, learn, and enjoy childhood safely. Today's events were a small but meaningful testament to the importance of guidance, patience, and understanding in the lives of children. The boys remained in the gazebo for a while longer, quietly observing the garden around them. Edward stayed close, his presence calm and reassuring, allowing them to enjoy the peaceful moment. He watched as George and Arthur exchanged small observations, sharing their thoughts and noticing the subtle beauty of the flowers, birds, and sunlight. Edward knew that these simple exchanges were shaping their understanding of respect, kindness, and cooperation. Eventually, Edward guided the boys back toward the main garden path, ensuring that their movements remained safe and coordinated. George walked closely beside Edward, occasionally glancing up with curiosity and trust. Arthur followed slightly behind, his confidence and awareness growing with each step. Edward observed both boys carefully, noting their understanding and respect for each other's space, and felt a quiet pride in how the day had unfolded. As the evening approached, Edward knew it was time to prepare for the conclusion of the day's activities. The palace gardens would soon be transitioning from playful exploration to a more orderly return to the main palace halls. Edward continued to guide the boys gently, reinforcing the lessons of the afternoon with every step. "Remember," he said softly, "we can explore and have fun, but always with care and consideration for those around us." Both George and Arthur nodded, understanding the importance of Edward's words. They walked along the path, observing the flowers, the trees, and the soft glow of the sunset, while Edward maintained a careful, protective presence nearby. The afternoon had transformed from a potentially tense situation into a meaningful, instructive, and enjoyable experience for both boys, guided by Edward's patience, experience, and empathy. As the garden began to quiet and the palace staff prepared to escort the children back inside, Edward allowed himself a brief, quiet moment of satisfaction. The boys had learned, grown, and enjoyed their time safely under his supervision. The earlier tension had transformed into cooperation, understanding, and a sense of respect that would remain with them beyond this afternoon. Edward knew that moments like these, though subtle, were among the most important parts of his role. And so, as the last rays of sunlight painted the palace gardens in warm shades of gold, Edward continued his watchful, patient, and attentive presence, quietly proud that his careful guidance had ensured safety, learning, and friendship, turning a small incident into a lasting and positive experience for Prince George and Arthur. The palace garden was bathed in the soft glow of the evening sun, casting long shadows across the neatly trimmed lawns and flower beds. The air carried a gentle warmth, and the faint scent of roses and jasmine lingered in the breeze. Birds chirped softly in the distance, and the fountain's water sparkled as it caught the last light of day. It was a calm, peaceful setting, perfect for reflection after a busy afternoon of exploration, learning, and careful guidance. Edward, the royal guard, observed quietly from a short distance, ensuring that Prince George and Arthur were safe as they prepared to end their time in the gardens. Prince George and Arthur walked slowly along the main path, their earlier energy now tempered by the lessons they had absorbed throughout the day. George occasionally paused to examine a flower or watch a butterfly flutter by, while Arthur followed closely, mindful of giving the younger prince space. Edward walked just behind them, his presence calm and reassuring, ready to intervene if necessary, but allowing the boys to enjoy the moment freely. The interactions between the two boys had changed significantly from earlier in the day. George's trust in Arthur had grown, and Arthur had learned to respect George's space and handle interactions with care and thoughtfulness. Edward reflected quietly on the transformation he had observed, from a moment of tension and misunderstanding to one of cooperation, respect, and mutual enjoyment. It was a reminder that small guidance and patience could have profound effects, shaping not only behavior but also relationships and understanding. As they reached a small, shaded area near the fountain, Edward suggested a brief pause. The boys sat on a low stone bench, watching the water ripple gently and listening to the soft sounds of the garden. Edward spoke softly, ensuring his voice carried warmth without authority. It's important to enjoy moments like this. Play, explore, and have fun, but always remember to be thoughtful and kind to those around you. George looked up at Edward and nodded, a smile spreading across his face. I like exploring, Edward, he said quietly, especially when I learn new things. Arthur, sitting nearby, also nodded, a faint smile of understanding on his face. I think I understand now, he said softly, that I have to be careful with my friends even when I'm excited. Edward felt a quiet pride in the boys. The lessons had been received with sincerity, and both children had learned something meaningful without feeling embarrassed or punished. Camilla, Arthur's mother, approached quietly, her eyes filled with a mixture of pride and relief. She watched her son, seeing the transformation in his behavior and understanding. She looked at Edward and said softly, "Thank you for your patience today. I can see that Arthur has learned a lot from you." Edward nodded politely, his expression calm and professional. "It's my pleasure, ma'am," he replied. "The boys have been very receptive and they've both done well." As the evening continued, Edward guided the boys back toward the palace, ensuring that their path remained safe and calm. The sun's fading light created a soft glow over the gardens, highlighting the flowers, trees, and fountains with a warm, golden hue. The palace staff moved quietly alongside them, maintaining order and ensuring that the transition from garden play to indoor calm was smooth and respectful. Edward remained attentive, scanning for any signs of potential hazards, while also allowing the boys a sense of independence as they walked. During the walk, George and Arthur continued to talk quietly, sharing observations and discoveries from their afternoon in the garden. George pointed out a cluster of daisies he had noticed earlier, and Arthur responded by describing the small insects crawling among the petals. Edward listened silently, observing the development of their communication skills, their attentiveness to one another, and the growing bond of trust and friendship. The earlier tension had completely transformed into cooperation and mutual respect. Edward reflected on the importance of such interactions in a royal setting. It was not always the grand events, ceremonies, or formal lessons that shaped young minds. Often it was the quiet moments of guidance, patient observation, and subtle instruction that had the most lasting impact. Today, he had seen firsthand how careful attention, empathy, and thoughtful intervention could turn a potentially negative situation into a positive, educational, and enjoyable experience for both boys. As they reached the palace entrance, Edward guided George and Arthur to a small seating area near the grand doors. The palace staff began preparing for the boys' transition back into the main halls, ensuring that their return would be orderly and smooth. Edward spoke softly to both boys once again, You've both done very well today. You explored, learned, and helped each other. Remember these lessons. They will help you grow, make friends, and enjoy life safely. George looked up with a bright, trusting smile. I will, Edward, he said earnestly. Arthur nodded, a sense of accomplishment and understanding in his expression. I will too, he added quietly. Edward felt a deep sense of fulfillment. His role had not only been about protection, but also about mentorship, teaching patience, kindness, and respect through example and guidance. Camilla approached once more, gently taking Arthur's hand. She looked at Edward with gratitude in her eyes. Thank you again for your guidance, she said softly. It means a lot to see him learning these lessons. Edward acknowledged her words with a polite nod. It's always a pleasure to guide and protect, he replied. The boys did very well, and they have shown great understanding today. The palace staff escorted the boys inside, Edward following closely behind to ensure their safety and comfort. The transition from the open, lively garden to the quieter, more formal interior of the palace required attentiveness, and Edward managed it with his usual calm precision. George and Arthur walked side by side, talking quietly, still reflecting on the day's experiences and the lessons they had learned from Edward's guidance. Once the boys were safely inside, Edward took a moment to observe the palace grounds from the doorway. The gardens, now bathed in the soft glow of dusk, were peaceful and serene. Children's laughter had faded into quiet memories of the afternoon, and the palace staff had returned to their duties. Edward reflected on the events of the day, feeling a quiet pride in his work. He had turned a potentially tense situation into a meaningful, instructive experience, ensuring safety, learning, and the growth of positive relationships. Edward knew that his work was never truly finished. The palace would always have children exploring, guests interacting, and situations requiring careful guidance and supervision. But today had been a reminder of the impact of patience, empathy, and attentiveness. He had helped shape a positive experience, one that the boys would remember as a lesson in kindness, respect, and friendship. As the evening settled in, Edward returned to his post near the palace gates, maintaining a vigilant but calm presence. The stars began to appear in the sky above, twinkling softly over the palace rooftops. The gardens were quiet, yet the lessons of the day lingered in the gentle conversations between George and Arthur, in their careful interactions, and in the quiet confidence they had gained. Edward understood that even small moments, handled with care and thoughtfulness, could leave lasting impressions on young minds. Edward allowed himself a brief, quiet moment of reflection. He had fulfilled his duty to protect, guide, and teach. He had ensured that Prince George was safe, and that Arthur had learned valuable lessons about respect and care. The day had been a success, not just in maintaining safety, but in nurturing growth, understanding, and friendship. These were the moments that defined his role, the quiet victories that often went unnoticed by the public, but were profoundly important in shaping lives. As the palace staff completed their evening routines and the last rays of sunlight disappeared beyond the horizon, Edward remained vigilant, standing quietly near the gates. He watched as George and Arthur continued to talk softly, now preparing to rejoin the other children and families inside. Edward's heart was calm, knowing that the lessons had been learned, the bonds had been strengthened, and the palace had remained a safe, nurturing space for everyone. Edward's day, filled with observation, guidance, and subtle intervention, came to a close with a sense of accomplishment. The earlier tension between George and Arthur had transformed into understanding, respect, and the beginnings of a meaningful friendship. Edward had played a vital role in shaping that transformation, ensuring that safety, learning, and joy coexisted in the palace gardens. And so, as the evening settled fully over the palace, Edward continued his quiet watch, proud that his patience, attentiveness, and guidance had made a real difference. He had turned what could have been a moment of tension into a lasting experience of growth, learning, and harmony, leaving both Prince George and Arthur with memories of a day spent safely, thoughtfully, and joyfully under his careful supervision.